You pour a drink at the end of a long week. You don't think about where it came from. You don't think about why it feels good or why your body seems to already know what to do with it. But the real answer is far stranger than a bottle on a shelf. It reaches back tens of millions of years, long before humans existed, long before fire, long before anything you'd recognize as civilization. Your relationship with alcohol didn't start with a recipe. It started with rotting fruit. Picture a forest floor millions of years ago. Fruit falls from the trees. It sits in the heat. Wild yeast lands on the sugars inside it and begins to feed. That feeding process is fermentation, and it produces a byproduct, ethanol, alcohol in other words. This wasn't made by anyone. It was made by nature, quietly, constantly, everywhere fruit fell to the ground. And your ancestors ate that fruit. Not humans yet. Not even close. These were small, tree-dwelling primates, distant relatives on a very long evolutionary road. But here's the strange part. Their bodies had to deal with the alcohol in that fermented fruit somehow. Either it made them sick every time, or something changed to let them handle it. Something changed. In 2014, biologist Matthew Carrigan led a study looking at the genetic history of an enzyme called ADH4. This enzyme breaks down alcohol in your gut and throat, turning it into something your body can process instead of something that poisons you. Carrigan's team found that around 10 million years ago, a single mutation in this gene made it 40 times more efficient at breaking down alcohol. 40 times. That's not a small tweak. That's a rewrite. Why would evolution favor that? Because the primates who could tolerate a little alcohol could also tolerate eating fruit that had started to ferment on the forest floor. And in a competitive environment, that mattered. Fresh fruit was contested, fallen. Fermenting fruit was often ignored by animals that couldn't process it. The primates who could eat it got an entire food source almost to themselves. This is the foundation of something researcher Robert Dudley later named the drunken monkey hypothesis. Dudley, a physiologist at UC Berkeley, proposed that your attraction to alcohol today isn't a modern flaw or a moral failing. It's an ancient survival signal. The smell of fermentation once meant food, calories, safety. Your brain still responds to that signal even though you're no longer foraging on a jungle floor. Think about that for a second. The same neural pathway that once told a primate, this rotting fruit means survival, is still active in you, right now, every time the scent of something fermented crosses a room. You didn't choose that response. It was inherited. But tolerating alcohol by accident is one thing. Making alcohol on purpose is something else entirely. So when did that shift happen? For a long time, historians assumed the answer was tied to farming. Grow grain, store it. And eventually the grain gets wet, ferments, and someone notices the effect. Bread and beer were often described as neighbors in that story, born from the same fields. But the timeline may run earlier than that. Archaeologist Patrick McGovern, sometimes called the world's leading expert on ancient alcoholic beverages, has spent decades analyzing pottery residue from early human sites. At Jiahu, a Neolithic village in China dating back roughly 9,000 years, McGovern's team found chemical traces inside clay jars. Rice, honey, and hawthorn fruit all fermented together into an early alcoholic drink. 9,000 years old. That places it before many of the farming settlements historians once assumed came first. Which raises an uncomfortable question. What if alcohol wasn't a byproduct of agriculture? What if it was one of the reasons humans started settling down at all? Some researchers have proposed exactly that. The idea is sometimes called the beer before bread theory. Instead of farming leading to alcohol, alcohol may have given people a reason to farm. A community that wanted a reliable supply of fermented grain had a motive to stop wandering, to plant, to return to the same patch of land season after season. Not survival alone. Pleasure, ritual, and shared experience helped pull people into settled life. That reframes everything you thought you knew about the beginning of civilization. Because before writing, before cities, before recorded history, someone stumbled onto a jar of grain that had gotten wet and forgotten. Days passed, the smell changed, curiosity or hunger or both pushed someone to try it anyway. And it did something to them. Their mood lifted. Their inhibitions dropped. For a brief window, the tension of survival eased. In a world defined by threat and scarcity, that must have felt like nothing else they had ever experienced. Word would have spread quickly, not through language necessarily, but through behavior. Others would have wanted to feel that too. This is where the story becomes less about biology and more about bonding. Anthropologists have long noted that shared intoxication tends to lower social barriers. Strangers relax around each other. Group loyalty strengthens. Rituals form. Some researchers argue that early alcohol consumption played a direct role in building trust between unrelated groups of humans, allowing larger and more cooperative communities to form than would have been possible otherwise. Alcohol, in this light, wasn't just a drink. It was a social technology. Still, none of this would have mattered if the human body hadn't already been primed for it, tens of millions of years earlier, back on that forest floor. So here is what actually happened, laid out in order. Wild yeast fermented fallen fruit long before anything human existed. A genetic mutation in a distant primate ancestor made alcohol tolerable rather than toxic. That tolerance became an advantage, then a preference, then something closer to an inherited craving. Thousands of generations later, early humans encountered fermentation again, this time in stored grains and fruit, and they recognized the effect immediately, even without knowing why their bodies responded the way they did. They began to recreate it on purpose. And that choice may have helped shape the earliest human settlements. None of this was planned by anyone at any stage. It emerged from accident, appetite, and a genetic accident that occurred long before intention entered the picture. Now, think about tonight. Think about a glass raised at a dinner table, a toast at a wedding, a drink shared after a hard day. It feels like a modern ritual, something invented recently for modern comfort. But you're not performing something new. You're repeating something your body has been rehearsing since before you were human at all. The smell of fermentation still means something to a part of your brain that predates language, predates fire, predates the very idea of being human. You pour a drink at the end of a long week, and without knowing it, you're answering a call that started falling from a tree 10 million years before anyone was there to catch it.